Hello there, people. In this segment, we will be looking at video games and the element of representation that comes out through its ecological space. Ecology here refers to the ecosystem, to use the term, of the video game space, both AIRL video game studios and the like, and elements within the video games themselves. A lot of discourse has already been done in terms of film analysis and even more when it comes to traditionally books and so on. These look at the ecology by those formats of what is essentially storytelling at the very core. Video games could be said to perform this storytelling on a dynamic and immersive, much more immersive manner, allowing the players or readers here a front row seat to the narrative, and in some examples, the ability to choose parts or even the whole narrative. In this video, we will be looking into this area created by video games and its surrounding culture. Fair warning, however, the space is still very much mainstream and non-inclusive in some senses if we look at terms of majority of players and communities, although many progressive and inclusive spaces have been created throughout the history of video games. For example, misogynistic and queerphobic nature of online gaming communities is a well-documented affair, and the very popular stereotype of racist lobbies of Call of Duty is a core element of early 2000s and even 2010s pop culture. But it must also be noted that the earliest commercial arcade video game, Pong by Atari, came out quite recently in comparison in 1970s, which is merely a half century ago. And the very first true video games came out in the 1950s, which is still not even a century ago. Compare this to books and movies that have been long for far longer and have some really what we would consider in the modern world bad examples of minority representation, even when it comes to things like book reading clubs or the equivalents of those in let's say arbitrarily the 1300s or 1400s. One would have to assume that they were quite bigoted and elitist spaces. We will look at the history of video games later. But before that, another aspect that needs to be clarified in regards to the disclaimers and so on that we are doing right now is regarding to the interactive nature of video games, and especially multiplayer video games like Call of Duty. Such games, it must be understood as less like a book and more like a reading circle where people from many different backgrounds can come together and engaging in the reading, or to use the term writing, of the artifact itself by playing the game together. And with the internet being a very comparatively still new thing, the racism, misogyny and queermisia of the lobbies mentioned earlier were examples of privilege affecting the interactions between the players who are mostly impressionable and attention-seeking children. The very stereotype of the racist Call of Duty player was that the first thing would be obviously a white young kid who spends all their time in their mother's basement, sort of the stereotype of the nerd who was a racist in spaces where the nerd now has privilege. So yeah, this queermisia of sorts and racism, misogyny all go hand in hand here. These affect the interactions between the players, and we need to ask ourselves who these multiplayer players were, which we would do in quite a while. But we won't primarily at this point look into this behavioral analysis, although it does seem quite interesting and a possible future avenue for research. But instead, we will be looking at the games themselves and their representational characteristics, especially in this video. There are quite a few places to look when it comes to representation in video games, and they come with a number of questions as well. So first off, we must ask, what is representation? Simply put, here we are using the term to mean any instances of non-normative identities being found, or uh, if it has found, it has to be put in the first place in the space of video games and even in the community. First, we will be looking at the games themselves, the playable characters, the NPCs, the lore, and so on, the elements of the game. Then we will shift our focus to the ecology of gaming, as in the community that plays through those playable characters, the status of certain NPCs within the community, as within the behavioral spaces of the game's communities. This video in particular, we would be looking at the game Elder Scrolls 5 Skyrim, because it is quite honestly one of the most popular games of the past decade, and another one is that it is one of the first role-playing games that you would come across if you are a beginner and want to engage in said space. Another key reason for choosing the game in this particular point is that the game came out in 2011, which was over a decade ago, and still has quite a few vibrant spots of community associated with it. So we would be looking at things like how NPCs like Nassim and Zarana are treated in the Elder Scrolls community, and certain factors contributing to them, and their representation. In this attempt, we may well go to what some might say overboard with our scrutiny, and it might seem to some that we are over analyzing something. The curtains might just have been blue, and not the entire elaborate thesis worthy statement. However, we will not let that stand in our way, as meaning is conferred and changed all the time in a flux like manner, much like Beauvois's ambiguity of consciousness, which applies here as the gamer or player keeps engaging with a different consciousness, and thus in an even more meta manner, this makes the gamer, irrespective of gender identity, more ambiguous than man or woman. Or maybe not, which is why we'll be doing this probable over analysis as an attempt to find, well, something. At the end of the day, all research is quite analogous to to looking out at the dark with the world's tiniest flashlight, and so we need to look at each and every inch of things. So we might fall into some over analysis. However, we would, which is one reason why we would keep this as open as possible, by which I mean that this would mostly be as subjective, this acceptance that this piece could very well be an extremely subjective matter, and yeah, discussion is encouraged. Moving on, Elder Scrolls V Skyrim is the fifth installment in the Elder Scrolls series of fantasy role-playing games by Bethesda Softworks. It was first released in 2011 and had a remastered special edition bundled with trade DLCs, some Creation Club content, and X64 capabilities, released in 2016. In the game, you play as a legendary dragon-slaying hero, arriving as a prisoner to the province of Skyr, in a time when it is in several turmoils, almost all of which our character can deal with over the course of multiple storylines in the game. The very first element we are going to analyze here is an NPC, whom you would find in probably the very first hold in the game you go to. But before we do that, let's talk about the racial element within the game. When talking about race in a fantasy setting, one thing to note is the fact that even though most of the races are fictional and created expressly for the purpose of the setting, and racial relations would be unique to that setting, there would be certain races that are always or almost always typecast as a certain kind. For example, in the general ambit of fantasy, if you look at the high elven or analogous racial uh, groups, they are almost always typecast as white. You have your Lord of the Rings elves and your gaming D&D elves, all of who are usually typecast as having light skin and slender features, almost to the point of femininity. Now this applies to the game here as well. The game features 10 races, and all of these races could have certain similarities with real world counterparts. Some of the more obvious ones: Bretons who hail from the in-game province of High Rock are seen to be an amalgamation of the usually attributed French and British aesthetics, mostly from the Middle Ages. Your full mail and plate armored knights and crusaders and so on. As on the similar vein, the Red Guards hailing from the province of Hammerfell, of which the NPC we are going to look at in this particular video belongs to, are dark-skinned people who have been both in lore and out of the lore when it comes to community interactions been typecast as black people from real world, and the political ideations of things to do with African and people from the Middle East are put into the place of the Red Guards. In lore, one thing we need to see is that they hail from the desert continent of Yokuda and have weaponry and so on associated with what would be the North African or Middle Eastern areas. You have curved swords that are reminiscent of the scimitars, and more than that, at the very basic level, we have their skin color to give us an indication of what race, what in real life race that this particular race is bound to represent. We have Nords who are from Scandinavia, as the name suggests, or rather the province of Skyrim, which is an analog to the ice-covered peaks of Scandinavia. You have other races too, which have quite a lot of similarities to different aspects of various different races. However, for this particular video, I think the description of the Red Guards is more than enough. The NPC we will be looking at today is Nazim. Nazim is a landowning NPC belonging to the in-game Red Guard race that we talked about earlier, who lives in the hold of Whiterun. Now a little bit of info about the Red Guards to recap. They are originally from the desert continent of Yokuda and are renowned warriors like most of the races in the Elder Scrolls universe. This particular game set in Skyrim, so because of that, one must surmise that Nazim had immigrated to Skyrim prior to the events of the game. Now, out of lore, the fact that we mentioned earlier that the Red Guards are dark-skinned, leading to them being considered the black people of the Elder Scrolls world, or an analog to real-life black people within the Elder Scrolls world. Now, analogs are not exactly the same as representation, but though that's the manner in which representation often works when it comes to fantasy or out of world settings. In the post apocalyptic settings and so on, such as those in Fallout and another video game franchise by the same company, which we would hopefully look in further videos, you have a basis to incorporate real world races and racial interactions and so on directly. But when it comes to fantasy and the blurring of reality, you need to apply certain racial attributes. In this particular area, we are looking at the fact that these two races, real life black people and the game's Red Guard race, are black, and we are making all analogs for representation on it. Usually this sort of representation is not exactly very easy to navigate, as most of the time fantasy ends up giving certain characteristics to a race. You always have your orcs or analogs of orcs. For example, if you look at Lord of the Rings or Warhammer 40k or most fantasy depictions, you have one beastly race whom you can't now give to anyone, where there is no problem with an orc. In lore, you have some outlying exceptions of intelligent orcs, even the stereotype assigned of being dumb brutes, as they are often called. For example, if you look at Lord of the Rings, or even when it comes to other iterations such as Warhammer 40k and so on, you have a certain characteristic assigned to that particular race. And now it becomes problematic when it comes to representation. However, in this particular scenario, I feel personally that the racial elements are more of guidelines, because as we see, this particular NPC itself is not a warrior, but is a merchant. You do not have to be a warrior purely because your race, the in-game race, gives you that stereotype of warriorness, by which we mean certain racial traits or powers that you get by virtue of belonging to a certain race. Now, those sort of essentialism applies in the end only to the player character, whereas it is still a matter that, so for example, if your character engages in fight or combat with a certain racial character of a different race, that character would use certain powers belonging to that race, or rather the combat mechanism would be a little different depending on the race of the opponent that our player character now chooses. So when it comes to combat, the racial characteristics apply. However, when it comes to the day-to-day life of the NPC, it does not seem to do so, which I would say is a good example of representation for any race. Now, moving on to the in-game analysis that we were doing, let's look at Nassim. The NPC in-game does not really have any mandatory interactions with the player character or PC. The character interacts with the PC randomly if the PC stays within engagement distance, like pretty much every other non-hostile NPCs do. But the character is one of the most mentioned and recognizable within the Elder Scrolls community, despite not even, as we said earlier, being a quest giver or having any bearing whatsoever on the overall plot of the game. This now has led to a strange place where now we have a character who doesn't contribute much to the gameplay or the lore or anything, is for all intents and purposes a side character, a random person you see on the street maybe. A character that is only there to expand on the lore, and a character in a very much non-confrontational area with our player character. The character is not a warrior, is not a mage, is in no way a competitive threat to the player character, who, as most fantasy games go, is one of the most strongest, or even the strongest element or person within the game's narrative. Now, why then is this particular NPC seen all so much or even too much within the community's memes and culture? This is what we shall be looking at further. What you see here is a list of posts that come up when I look up Nazim on Reddit. I have not logged into my account, so this is an algorithm-free expression or an algorithm-free example that you might get whenever you log in, regardless of what your particular preferences are or your thoughts regarding the character are. Now, as you can see, the character has been mentioned a lot by many posts, and most of them are players venting their frustration on the character. But as we saw earlier, the NPC does not really have any role in the gameplay. Unlike maybe some NPCs that make the PC do something, that the player, in particular the real life player, or rather the stereotypical gamer, would not like. This will come back in a future video as we look at a different NPC altogether. But for now, so where does this hatred come from? The answer to it seems to lie in one line that the character says, which is repeated throughout the community.
Do you get to the Cloud District very often? Oh, what am I saying? Of course you don't.
Now, this line is seemingly considered to offensive to the player character as an arrogant, jerkish manner of the character Nazim, the NPC here, portraying themselves as a unlikable and most importantly arrogant person that now the player character has some reason to hate. Now, what we are looking for here, because after all we are looking for representational issues, is a little bit more deeper than this of the face arrogant person that we are introduced to. So where does this arrogance come from? Or rather, is there something more deeper at work here than just your normal blank-faced player character meeting an arrogant person and having a sense of hatred towards that person? First, let's look at in-lore things. As we said earlier, we would be looking at both in-lore as well as out-of-lore, like community understandings of certain characteristics of the game. So in-lore, Nazim is the owner of Chilforo Farm, a farm right outside the first province that we go to now, first hold that we go to now within the province. And that makes Nazim a landowner. However, due to game scripting issues, or maybe it was a design choice, the character does not sleep at the farm or the house attached to the farm, but lives within the walls of Whiterun, sleeping at an inn, and spends the character's time mostly going to the Jarl, or the equivalent of a mayor, I presume, a palace, and spends the character's time there. Now, the question is, how does this have a bearing on the representation? What does this mean when it comes to representation? We see a non-warrior, non-mage, your everyday life, run-of-the-mill person who, for all intents and purposes, is an analog to a black person within the social structure, in a place of certain levels of power. So your usual landlords, or your usual social ladder climbers, if you will. Now, this particular person, this particular NPC, has reached this position of power without going out to war or being a soldier or so on. At least as far as we know. I did search through lore for a bit, and as far as we know, this character has no military background. He's an immigrant to the land of Skyrim and has made their life here. Now, let's look at the out-of-lore characteristics surrounding the character, and for the purposes of time, I'm thinking we would leave the interpretation open to an extent. We would just be looking at the different characteristics of how the community interprets this character and then leave it off open. The line that the community has found offense with or reason to hate the character with is said often unprompted, which seems to have earned that character this arrogant reputation. However, I tried talking to the NPC a couple more times, and the responses actually shed more light on this character's identity within the game, and it must be assumed that since the players have engaged with the character, these would also have shaped the community's understanding or engagement with the character, which can was, as we saw earlier, quite a lot violent.
You look a bit peaked. You sure you shouldn't be home in bed? Is it absolutely necessary for you to bother me right now? Oh, it took years, but I earned my way to the top. I own Chilfaro Farm, you see. Very successful business, obviously. I actually advise the Jarl on political matters. My input is invaluable, of course, but this is all probably a bit over your head. Speak. Yes, yes, I haven't got all day. Yes. Yes, yes, I haven't got all day. Need something? Yes. Need something?
So, what we have here is an NPC who barely interacts with the player character, and even then, not in a significantly confrontational or impactful way when it comes to gameplay, but whose arrogance or perceived arrogance has had him be hated by a large group within the community to the extent that it is a meme to find different ways to slay the character. Now, this means that the player, put in a position of too much power, if you ask me, feels hatred towards a common farm owner who has climbed social levels or social hierarchies within a completely alien land by virtue of being an immigrant. Now, does this have any bearing on the racial representation? Does this immigrant land owning and social hierarchy climbing nature have any sort of mirror with real world racial elements and how people are treated? Now, one thing to be remembered is that the player character for most of the Elder Scrolls series is at the end of the day left open ended. You choose which race your character belongs to. But for purposes of cover art and so on, which is loosely connected to lore, and the community does not consider the lore, or rather the lore element of this cover art, as having too much weightage, but the player character for Skyrim is usually shown to be a Nord. A Nord, as we said earlier, is the other primary inhabitants of Skyrim, the province of Skyrim, and are modeled after real life Scandinavians and your usual Viking aesthetics and so on, with their fondness for steel forging uh, and their usual, understanding of being barbarians and very loud drunks. The entire stereotype revolves around the player character being a person belonging to the race that inhabit the province the game is set in. Now, this does not exactly have too much of a bearing here because most of the player characters could be pretty much anyone. There is a running meme that everyone has this basic node playthrough. You play a node in your first playthrough, and there is also an understanding that there is a difference when it comes to playing as a node or a different person, which the game dynamically incorporates. For example, I haven't uploaded a clip of that here, but a very short interaction is that if you are playing as a node and interact with other characters, they would refer to you with terms that are more endearing than if you play as another character, where you get the usual outsider treatment. Now, moving back to Nazim and the problem with representation here, we see an immigrant being arrogant, obviously. And now, how does the player character within the community made of multiple player characters, choose to react to the character. As we saw earlier, most of this hatred and animosity now is being festered towards a video game character that again has posed no threat to the player character. Your player character can shout apart towns and fling people off the ends of cliffs, can fight dragons on a regular basis and slay entire armies in lore. And now, particular this so-called all-powerful character feels threatened by an immigrant successful landowner who has political ambitions, as we see, and now is being threatened. This character now threatens the player character so much that you have videos of such nature being posted, and we must be reminded that it has been over a decade that the game has been launched, and yet we have the community reacting in overall aggressive ways to character. Mere aggression, this aggression wouldn't be a result of the mere annoyance at or NPC's arrogance. And that is why we must look at the racial element as well. And the representation here we could see work dynamically. Now, the player character is an empty shell, is someone with no actual voice lines. Your character does not speak out loud. Your character engages with the external surroundings, has certain lines, has certain options, but when it comes to this interaction with Nazim, your character does not speak. Now, that means that the reactions that we saw on Reddit or any other platforms that we could see is the way that we decide as a community, as a group of people, who could be anyone, which way your particular character, your particular player character interacts in this scenario. And here we see a sense of aggression towards this outsider being, and we see how this represents most of how real world racial relations happen. Now, it could also be that the player character here, plays the red god as well, and maybe people just hate arrogant non-playable characters that much. However, as I said earlier, and for the sake of time, we are going to leave this as an open-ended question. Would you think that the racial element influences a lot of the characters, the aggression faced by the character within the community, or is it purely just the arrogance? Is it just a simple case of an arrogant NPC being hated? That's the question. In the next video, we would look at a different NPC and hopefully have a much more detailed discussion regarding the character and especially the representational aspects. And it is hoped that since we are done with the introduction, and this video would be a way of gauging what particular elements of representation we would want to look forward, that the next video would offer us much more time to focus purely on the NPC and the community, obviously. So until then, I think this is me signing off.